Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives. Our guest today is Jonathan Morrow, an attorney in Washington, D.C., who is also the Senior Legal Advisor to the Kurdistan Regional Government Ministry of Natural Resources. Welcome, Mr. Morrow.
Pleasure to be here, John.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved with Kurdistan.
Well, I'd not long after finishing law school, I'd clerked for a judge in Australia and then was offered a position by the United Nations to advise the United Nations and the government of East Timor on constitutional matters, and there became very interested not only in East Timor's constitution, but East Timor's oil and gas. It's an oil-rich country, a lot of offshore oil and gas. From there I made friends with some people who had been close to the Kurds, Ambassador Peter Galbraith being one of them. He was senior political advisor to the UN chief in East Timor, and he at one point recommended to the Kurds that they engage someone like me who had an experience advising governments with natural resources. So that's how I made my way, as it were, to Kurdistan and to Iraq.
Good. Now, we've had a number of Kurdish speakers and speakers on Kurdish topics here at the university, but we haven't had anyone who's been involved with natural resources and oil in particular. So I think this is a fascinating new angle for us to explore. Why don't you give us a sense of the amount of oil that is in the geographic area of Kurdistan, both discovered and potentially discovered?
Sure. It's a difficult question to answer because, as I think you know, for various historical reasons, the oil in Kurdistan was deliberately left in the ground unexplored. And because there was little or no exploration, it's very hard to know exactly how much there is. Geologically, it's thought to be a very prospective area. There are high hopes for significant oil and gas plays in the Kurdistan region. But until the current round of exploration that's now going on is completed, it will be difficult to know. A couple of fields have been discovered and tested. Some estimates vary, but there may be already some millions of barrels discovered, but it remains to be seen how much. The Kurdistan Oil Minister, the Kurdistan government, estimates as a very rough calculation that there could be as many as 25 billion barrels in Kurdistan. To give you some idea of how much that is, Iraq as a whole is thought at the moment to have about 110, 115 billion barrels. So it would be not a very large amount compared to Iraq, certainly, but it's still a very significant amount of petroleum if those guesses are accurate.
Very significant. I would imagine in the post-Saddam era, we still haven't ironed out all the details regarding the division of resources and other things. Tell us about some of the controversies in that area on the oil issue specifically.
Sure. Well, the question of an oil law for Iraq has got a lot of media attention. Iraq, to this day, still does not have an oil law. There has been a tension, a contest, if you like, between the Kurds in the Kurdistan region in the north and the Baghdad government over who controls certain oil fields. Those tensions actually have been largely resolved now. The Kurds have a constitutional right to manage the fields inside the Kurdistan region, and that's relatively uncontroversial. There's a draft oil law that reflects this. The real problem at the moment, as we speak now in February 2009, is that there are many non-Kurdish Iraqis who don't want an Iraq oil law because they fear foreign investment. They fear theft, if you like, of their natural resources. This is a very different sentiment to that you find in Kurdistan, of course, where they're very pro-investment. You have a lot of Western oil companies and companies from other countries from the east as well looking for oil. So there's a big difference in philosophy between the Kurds and the government in Baghdad. But the real challenges for Iraq as a whole now, not so much to do with Kurdistan, more to do with convincing ordinary Iraqi people that foreign investment is good, that an oil law is good and a necessary vehicle for foreign investment.
Where does the fear come from? You said that there's the fear that someone may try to take it. Is there a precedent for this in recent times, or is it just a concern that's residual from the past?
Well, you don't have to look. The fear is not entirely irrational, of course. You don't have to look too far afield. Plenty of countries in Africa, and in fact the oil industry in its inception in the Middle East really did take enormous shares of oil, giving the governments of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, for instance, very little in return. This, of course, over the course of the 20th century shifted very much more in favour of the oil or other natural resource producing government. So now the average oil contract is much more favourable to the government. I mean, the case of East Timor, where I work, for instance, is a very good example. A country that had been exploited as a colony in years gone by, nonetheless put in place oil contracts that were very favourable to it, and has now become a very new nation, but a very successful oil-producing nation without, I think, anyone being able to seriously criticise the arrangement as being exploitative of the Timorese people. So there's Iraqis, I think, do look to the rather remote history of the Gulf states, and I think that also in Iraq there was a culture that Saddam was part of, frankly, in which as a member of OPEC it was the most aggressively anti-Western, and I think there is still a residual hostility towards Western investment, frankly, which is not the dominant theme in Iraqi politics, but it's still there, it's still strong, and I think it still is an obstacle to a Iraq oil law.
Now, you made reference to the oil resources within the geographic area of Kurdistan, but there are some resources in disputed areas. Tell us about those disputes and where those seem to be heading.
Sure. Well, the area that people know best is Kirkuk. There's a supergiant oil field in around the city of Kirkuk in the province of Kirkuk, and some surrounding oil fields. All of these fields are in what is called disputed territories. This is a defined term in the Iraq constitution. Disputed territory is territory disputed between the Kurdistan regional government on the one hand and the government of Baghdad. The outcome of that dispute will, at least the Kurds hope, be resolved by a referendum, an act of self-determination of the peoples who live in those disputed areas, whether they want to be part of the Kurdistan region or not. And it's the outcome of that referendum that will determine whether those fields, including the Kirkuk oil field, is part of the Kurdistan region or not. To give you some idea of the size of these fields, I mean, they could be, I don't have the precise number, but it could be something like 15 or 20 billion barrels, possibly more than that if you take into account the fields that surround Kirkuk proper. So this certainly adds an element of tension into the resolution of those territories, although I very much hope that revenue sharing agreements, in particular an agreement that wherever Kirkuk ends up in Kurdistan or outside, the revenues will all be shared centrally and allocated according to the constitution throughout Iraq to all Iraqis.
Do you feel that we're making progress toward resolving some of these issues now, or are we as far away from a resolution as we've always been?
I wish I could give an optimistic answer. I think that there are some hopeful signs. There's more work now being done by the US and the United Nations as well on Kirkuk. They're addressing themselves to the problem, trying to understand it. Whether that, of course, translates into an outcome remains to be seen. In some ways, I think, unfortunately, the Iraqi government itself, under Prime Minister Maliki, is less inclined to solve the problem than previous governments. So that's the disputed territories. An oil law, I think, is now, as frankly, as far away as it's ever been. There is still a lot of animosity towards the idea within the Iraqi political scene. And on revenue sharing, again, on that I think that really a lot depends on how the US and the UN decide to proceed with that. I think there's an enormous amount of headway that can be made if a revenue sharing agreement can be reached first, because this will then make it much easier, for the reasons I've described, make it much easier to resolve the disputed territories. You won't have to worry about where the Kirkuk money goes to, and also make it easier for there to be an oil law as well.
If these issues are resolved in the near or intermediate future, what do you think Kurdistan's economic potential is?
I think Kurdistan's economic potential, frankly, is very good, even if these issues are not resolved. And this is, I think, one of the very sensible approaches that the Kurds have taken. They're not separating themselves from Iraq, but they are making sure that their economy is not dependent on decisions made in Baghdad. So, for instance, you have the oil investment coming into Kurdistan now, regardless of the fact there's no Iraqi oil law, because the Kurds have passed their own law. They've got their own contracts that are consistent with the constitution. They're doing everything by the book, but they're not waiting around. They're moving quickly. You'll go to Erbil, capital of Kurdistan now, you'll see a lot of oil companies. A whole suburb of Erbil is really now just simply the offices, the regional offices of oil companies. A lot of construction, a lot of seismic crews coming in from various countries in the world to lay the seismic equipment. As a result of this, a lot of oil field service companies, people who provide services to oil companies. And then, of course, you have something of a construction boom in Kurdistan anyway. And what's interesting about that is that the majority of the firms that have invested there in the construction side are Turkish. There's a huge amount of Turkish investment. The single largest origin of investment in Kurdistan is actually from Turkey. The non-oil sector part of the Kurdistan economy, I think, has a question mark over it. I think it's very important for the Kurds, as with any other oil-producing part of the world, to make sure they diversify their economy. But it's certainly in terms of oil, their economy is solid. To return to your question, though, if there is an oil law for the whole of Iraq, if there is a revenue-sharing law, if there is an agreement on disputed territories, there's no question that these would provide an additional boost to investor confidence in Kurdistan. The Kurds would themselves, if Iraq as a whole is able to attract more foreign investment and raise oil production, then of course Kurdistan benefits from that in a revenue sharing environment. So there are indirect benefits to Kurdistan for success in Iraq. This is one of the reasons why the Kurds, contrary to a lot of opinion, actually really want Baghdad to make successful decisions, because they are shareholders in Baghdad. They derive a large part of their revenue, a very large part at the moment, from Baghdad revenues, from Iraq-wide revenues.
We're talking about natural resources in Iraq and Kurdistan in particular. Is it essentially oil and gas, or are there other resources, especially in Kurdistan, that might come into the conversation?
Well, the minister whom I advise is the Minister for Natural Resources. This includes, of course, not just oil, but also potentially minerals. It is, again, without anyone really knowing, it is thought that the region is rich in minerals. Precisely which ones, no one really knows. I think people are extrapolating from their studies in Iran. There's been some exploration and prospecting there, making educated guesses about Kurdistan, the possibility of copper and gold and maybe diamonds, marble. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the area is rich in minerals. Because oil has been the most easy commodity to exploit and the one that's in greatest demand, that's where the Kurdistan government has moved most quickly. But fairly soon I would expect the government will be developing a minerals policy, seeking to attract mining companies to the region. And then there are other economic. There is actually a fairly large agricultural industry in Kurdistan. The Kurds are now exporting fruit and vegetables to some of the Gulf states. This is only slow. I mean, it's only just starting up, but because Kurdistan is a market-friendly, investor-friendly country that is looking to establish trading relationships with all of their neighbours in the region, in Europe and the US. The possibility of opening up new markets, including for other primary products and food, will no doubt be exploited.
Now, in your work, are you a senior advisor on a global basis, or is it specifically in terms of relationships with certain countries? Kurdistan, U.S., Kurdistan, something else. How does that work?
In my career, I've advised almost entirely governments. At the moment, I'm advising the Kurdistan government largely on oil matters, because oil is where the demand is greatest, and that's where I have experience. But there are many other legal issues that the KRG needs to understand. I mean, they have they're drafting their own constitution, for instance, now as a part of, to fit in with the federal structure of
and you're involved
Iraq.
with that process.
I've been involved in that. I mean, it's being drafted by Kurdistan parliamentarians and politicians, but the Kurds certainly have turned to me and some others for advice on this. When the minerals regime is rolled out by the Kurdistan government, I expect to be involved in that. In fact, I'm starting work on that already at the direction of the minister. So primarily at the moment, I'm working for the Minister for Natural Resources, helping him negotiate contracts, draft laws, but sometimes I'll go further afield, work on the constitution, for instance.
Moving away from natural resources specifically into a more general discussion, we've had other speakers talk about the expanding Kurdish footprint both in the Middle East and globally. Talk a little bit about that and where you think the possibilities are.
Well, the Iraqi Kurdistan, and probably Kurdistan more generally, if you look at areas in the Middle East that are dominant, have a predominantly Kurdish, have a large diaspora. I mean, of course, in the case of Iraqi Kurdistan, this is a result of a series of, let's say, genocidal events. There are Kurds all over the world. I think it'll be very interesting to see how well Kurdistan can capitalise on this diaspora. I think it's already starting to do this, rather than seeing it as a liability for a country that many of its citizens, its inhabitants have left or fled overseas. Instead of worrying about that, to actually use them as a resource, I think is the challenge. I think the Kurds are doing that very well. For instance, the Kurdish oil minister, whom I mentioned, Dr. Ashti Horami, is part of that diaspora. The Kurdistan government has brought him back to serve as minister. He has family and a life and a career that he left behind in London, to which he'll presumably return at some point, but they've been able to draw on this outside expertise. And in fact, I would say they're doing that better than almost any other country that I've been able to observe, including, in fact, Iraq itself. The Kurds really do have a talent pool in their ministry that is second to none, and in part because they've used their diaspora. It'll also be interesting, of course, since the Kurds in Iraq and Kurds in the Middle East generally find themselves in very complex and difficult political positions, to see the way in which new generations of people who identify as Kurds but may not have grown up in Kurdistan, may not be speaking Kurdish, second generation Kurdish diaspora, will become part of an effort globally to raise people's understanding of Kurdish culture, Kurdish history, Kurdish political problems, ambitions, and so on. But it's very encouraging to see that both in the US and in Europe, even in my own country, Australia, there's a lot of activity going on.
Talk a little bit about the relationship between Kurdistan and the United States, where you see that going. Is there a fundamental understanding here, generally speaking, of who the Kurds are and the role that Kurdistan plays in Iraqi politics, or do we have a lot of work ahead of us?
Look, I think at a basic level, of course, the Kurds recognise that the US is a natural friend and ally, and the Kurds have done a lot, including in recent years, to assist US goals, including in Iraq. I mean, the Kurdish military forces, the Peshmerga, assisted the US in coming in from the north in 2003 to remove the Saddamist regime. I mean, they lost lives in assisting US soldiers. Similarly, and they understand that the US to the extent that the Kurds want foreign investment, the US will be a source of this. Similarly, the other side of the relationship, I think in the US government and even in the US population now, there's a sense in which people are starting to understand that unlike some other populations and regions in the Middle East, the Kurds really are friendly to them and are supportive of them, and that these are people who are deserving of American assistance. What troubles me, though, is that it's sometimes the conversation between Iraqi Kurdistan, let's say, and the Kurds in general, and the US, they speak at cross purposes. For instance, in Kurdistan, there is a sense in which they expect that the US government will save them from the danger of another genocide taking place. The Kurds obviously suffered tremendously at the hands of Saddam. They have enormous faith in America, that America won't let this happen again. I worry that it may be the case that in the United States, memories are short. People don't realise how the Kurds were let down, how dangerous it is in the Middle East still, and how there remains a possibility that the Kurds are in danger. I worry that faith may be a little misplaced, and then there's a lot of work that needs to be done to remind Americans, and not just Americans, of course, but Europeans and others of the history, of the recent history. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of work to be done. The Kurds. One other aspect of this, of course, is that the Kurds feel that they have been tremendously supported by the US in Iraq. That when the US removed Saddam, this was done for Kurdish benefit, and the Kurds have benefited tremendously from it. The prosperity I've just been describing is a result of the removal of Saddam in large part, thanks, very much, of course, to the US government. However, I think what a lot of Kurds don't understand is that the benefits that went to Kurdistan were actually unintentional. It wasn't actually a deliberate policy on the part of the US government to support Kurdistan. In fact, I think the US government, at least the last administration, might have preferred Kurdistan to sacrifice some of its prosperity in order to be part of a unitary state of Iraq rather than a federal state. So there's been some miscommunication. There are some misunderstandings that need to be corrected.
Just to wrap up, what do you think are the short-term prospects for Kurdistan? Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or not sure?
Oh, I'm very optimistic. The Kurdish leadership is not without its problems. Kurdistan is not without its challenges. It's evolving rapidly from a more or less a tribal society, which was not that long ago, was riven by intra-Kurdish fighting into what we now see as something becoming a liberal democracy. But there's still human rights problems. There are still civil liberties problems. The government is very enlightened. They're taking the country in the right direction. So I'm optimistic that with the right help, Kurdistan will be an extremely successful part of the world, and in fact, part of the solution to other Middle Eastern problems, not adding to our list of concerns that arise from that part of the world.
Good. Well, on that note, I will say thank you to you, Mr. Morrow.
Thanks very much. My pleasure, John.
And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, and we'll see you next time.